Good morning, students. Today we're going to get into chapter 24, which is all about revolution, specifically revolution all over the world. And section 1 deals with revolution in the Latin American areas. We just came off chapter 23 talking about the French Revolution, and prior to that, the American Revolution. So now we're going to see revolutions breaking out in Latin America. Latin American society was similar to that of pre-revolutionary France in that society was divided into very distinct classes. These classes were something you were born into and dictated everything about your life, who you interacted with, what kind of job you had, and whether you were allowed to participate in the governing of your state or not. The first group of people were known as the Peninsulares. These people were born on the Iberian Peninsula of Spain and were at the very top of society. And these were a very small percentage of the people of Latin America. Only these people were allowed to hold government office in any way whatsoever. So this meant that no one actually from Latin America could be in charge of the government, which, as you can imagine, probably presented some problems. The next group were the Creoles, who were Spaniards who were born in Latin America, and they were below the Peninsulares in rank and could not hold high office, but they did have some social mobility as officers in the Spanish colonial armies, so they at least had that going for them. And between these two groups, most of the land, wealth, and power was consolidated in the colonies. Below these two groups came the mestizos, which were people of mixed European and Native American ancestry, and below them were the mulattoes, who were people of European and African ancestry, and then even below them were the enslaved Africans. Native Americans, or as they were referred to in your book, Indians, were made up the vast majority of the population, yet they were considered the lowest class with the enslaved Africans. News of other revolutions around the world encouraged the Latin Americans to rise up. The very first was Haiti, and later this would be, we know it as Haiti now, but at this period it was called Saint Dominique. And it was the first colony to rise up and gain independence. It was a French colony, and they took the opportunity presented to them by the chaos of the French Revolution to rise up. Their leader was Toussaint L'Ouverture, and the French arrived to try to put down this revolution, and Toussaint agreed to step down as long as slavery was going to be abolished. So the French agreed to this, but then very quickly turned their back on this agreement as soon as they regained control of the island. Toussaint was arrested and sent to the French Alps in prison where he died. And then his lieutenant, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, took up the fight for freedom and eventually overthrew the French and took control of the island, which he renamed Haiti, which in the local language of the natives meant mountainous land. And Haiti is still a country today. Among the people in Latin America, the Creoles were the least oppressed, but this was because they were also the best educated and the wealthiest. They often traveled to Europe for their education and were influenced there by the European ideas and feelings. And this led to several of them returning from their education in Europe with the excitement of revolution and the ideas of the Enlightenment. So around this period, Napoleon marched in to conquer Spain because he wanted to enforce the continental system, which we talked about last chapter, and overthrew the Spanish government and placed his brother on the throne. And in the minds of the colonists, they were okay with being ruled by a rightful king at this point. But once what they believed was an unrightful king was on the throne, this was not okay. So rebellion broke out in several parts of Latin America, and they started to drive towards independence. And this was led specifically by the Creoles, who were rallied by these ideas of the Enlightenment that they had from their education overseas. The revolution was led primarily due to the strength of brilliant Creole generals. The very first one that we're going to talk about is Simon Bolivar. And Bolivar was from Venezuela, who declared their independence in 1811. At first, their battle for freedom struggled. There were some losses of battles, and Bolivar actually had to go into exile twice, but he didn't give up. He kept fighting. And by 1819, the tide had turned, and Bolivar led 2,000 soldiers on a march through the Andes Mountains into Colombia and took the Spanish by surprise and won. and by 1821 had won independence for his country. Then he decided to march back down towards Ecuador, where he met another brilliant general that was campaigning for independence, Jose de San Martin. San Martin, was from Argentina, and he had declared independence for Argentina in 1816. However, nearby in Peru and Chile, there were Spanish forces that he believed were posing a threat. So he led his army also across the Andes into Chile and freed it. Next, he wanted to march to Lima and drive the forces out of Peru, but needed help. So at this point, he joined with Bolivar, who was just fresh off a victory, and they joined forces. So we don't really know what happened or what went down between them, but they decided to join forces, and San Martin turned over control to Bolivar. And he led both armies on to defeat the Spanish at the Battle of Peru. And this was the last battle for freedom in South America. The future countries of Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, and Ecuador were all united into a single country called Gran Colombia. So in most of Latin America, specifically South America, the drive for freedom was led by the Creoles. However, things were a little bit different in Central America, specifically in Mexico. In Mexico, the lines of social class were not as strict as we talked about earlier in this section. They weren't really divided among the races in the same way, and the social classes mixed a little more freely. So due to this, the drive for freedom in Central America, specifically Mexico, was led by a variety of people, namely the Indians and the mestizos. One of the main people that really pushed this freedom was Padre Miguel Hidalgo. He was a priest from a small village named Dolores, and he took the first steps towards independence for Central America. He was poor but very well educated and was a very strong believer in the ideas of the Enlightenment. He decided one day to ring the bells of his church, and this caused everyone to come gather in the square. And once they arrived, he led a very impassioned speech calling for rebellion against the Spanish. And this speech, this call that he made, is known as the Grito de Dolores, or the Call of Dolores. The next day, Hidalgo's followers, made up mostly of Native Americans, or as your book, like I said, the book calls them Indians, and mestizos, began marching towards Mexico City. And as they marched, more people joined them, led and inspired by the rebellion. Soon they grew to an army of over 80,000 people. And this uprising really started to scare the upper classes and the Spanish army. So the two groups met in battle in 1811, and Hidalgo's army was defeated, mostly because it was not a formal army led by generals, but they had numbers on their side, so it was a huge battle. And after the defeat, the rebels rallied around another leader, Jose Maria Morales. And for 4 years, they followed Morales, but he was defeated in 1815 by a Creole officer whose name I'm probably going to butcher, but his name is Agustin de Iturbide. I'm not quite sure if that's the authentic way to say it, but he's important, so I'm going to try and say his name correctly. The push for independence didn't stop there. In 1820, a liberal group took power in Spain, and so they believed more in the ideas of enlightenment and did not believe in the oppression of lower classes and believed more in equality. And so this caused the Creoles, who had most of the power in the colonies, to fear the loss of their own power. So instead of following the lead of Spain, they wanted to declare independence from Spain for Mexico so that they could control the power there. And in a twist of fate, the same Creole officer, Iturbide, who defeated Morales, was the one to proclaim independence on behalf of Mexico. So Iturbide declared himself emperor and wished to rule all over Central America in the same way that Spain did, because the seat of this colony and this way that they did things was in Mexico. And soon after he declared independence, the colonies began to declare independence for themselves, meaning that they would no longer follow Spain's lead or the lead of Mexico. Iturbide tried to ignore these declarations of independence and was eventually overthrown. And soon all of Central America had declared their independence. And this included, I didn't write it down, so let's see. This included a lot of the different countries that you still will see in Central America today, including Nicaragua, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Costa Rica. So this region would develop into those countries after that. Now, getting back to some of the other areas, of all of the colonies in Central and South America pushing towards independence, Brazil's quest was very unique, and so that's why we're going to talk about it specifically. It occurred without any violent upheavals, without any battles or bloodshed, which, in my opinion, are the best kinds of revolutions. And in fact, a member of the Portuguese royal family helped lead the freedom movement, which is very unusual because usually royalists are not big on letting people be independent. So let's kind of go back. Let's remember that Napoleon's army invaded Spain and Portugal because he wanted to come through and enforce the continental system. He didn't want anybody trading with Britain, and Portugal was not obeying this very well. And so Napoleon marched through Spain to get to Portugal in an effort to close their ports to trade. And as the French troops were marching through Spain and getting close to the capital of Portugal, the royal family, including Prince John, boarded ships to evade capture and headed towards Brazil, which was their largest and richest colony. And once they reached there, they stayed there for 14 years, ruling their empire from Brazil. So they effectively moved the capital of their empire, the Portuguese empire, to Brazil and waited out Napoleon, basically stayed there until he was driven from power, and even waited a few years after his defeat. It was about 6 years after his defeat. And Prince John, who now was King John, boarded a ship and returned to Portugal to reassume his throne, and left his son Dom Pedro to rule Brazil in his stead. King John's plan was to return Brazil back into a colony. However, the people there had enjoyed being a capital. They liked being an important city. They didn't want to go back to being a colony where they had to send money and wealth and supplies back to Portugal. So they kind of chafed under this and didn't like it. And around 1822, the Brazilians began to demand from Dom Pedro independence from Portugal. They wanted to go back to being in charge of themselves, like they were when they were the seat of power. And Dom Pedro eventually agreed because so many people were in favor of this and declared independence, and they became independent with no bloodshed whatsoever, making this revolution very, very unique in comparison to all the others.